Hi, y'all. I'm Atticus, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we are pleased to welcome Simon Jacobs and Eugene Lim to our At Home with Literati series in support of STRINGFOLLOW. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I'll be dropping links to purchase STRINGFOLLOW throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature to submit questions at any time. A reminder that you can shop for more books in-store or at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States. And now let me introduce tonight's author and moderator. Simon Jacobs is the author of the novel Palaces and the short fiction collections Masterworks and Saturn, a collection of David Bowie stories. His fiction has appeared in Tin House, Black Warrior Review, and Joyland. He is from Dayton, Ohio, and I just learned lives in Portland. Eugene Lim is the author of novels Fog and Car, The Strangers, and Dear Cyborgs. His writings have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, The Baffler, Dazed, Fence, Little Store, Granta, and elsewhere. He is a high school librarian, runs Ellipses Press, and lives in Queens, New York with Joanna and Felix. So now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Simon and Eugene.
Thank you. Thanks, Atticus, and thank you, Eugene, for joining me tonight. I'm really grateful. I'm so grateful to you, Atticus, and to Literati Bookstore, and to Eugene for having this conversation this evening. And Literati actually played gracious host to me during my first book tour for my first novel, Palaces, about 4 years ago. So it's fun that, you know, we've come full circle to, you know, and I get to do another event with y'all. So yeah, well, to kick us off, I thought I could read a brief excerpt from the book STRINGFOLLOW that we're here to talk about. Yeah, I'm just going to read a brief section from the opening here, just give you a sense of what it's like. The route to Sarah was easy, or should have been, because she spent a lot of time at Beth's house, and Beth had a spooky older brother named Greg who was into serial killers and chokeholds and shit. So he had a lot of contact and had laid a lot of groundwork without knowing it, well before our arrival. Like, he'd drift by Beth's bedroom where she and Sarah were hanging out and just linger in the doorway. And when Beth wasn't looking, he'd blink and show Sarah he'd painted a set of eyes on his eyelids, or he would pull up his sleeve to reveal the patterns he'd cut into his arm, or would be mumbling what sounded like occult prayers when the three of them got into his car in the morning on the way to school. There was no consistency to it whatsoever. The idea was basically to project that there was some secret regimen of behaviors that Greg adhered to out of spiritual or small group obligation. And for a kid who mostly just hid in his room, consuming fringy internet era media and coming up with ways to alienate people / himself, this was a pretty easy thing to do. Greg didn't have the context for this at the time, of course. He was just being himself, and his behavior was just that teenager routine. But in retrospect, after the fact, these were the shapes it had, that we gave it. Sarah took note. It was practically ingrained in her. She was carefree with her attention and love, and only had to hear about someone's misfortune or depression before she hurled herself wholeheartedly into it. Her passion and talent was for being there, it's capitalized, until whatever problem became hers as well. Impressively hers, so bone deep ran this empathy. She was the sort of person to whom, no matter how well you knew her, you could express the slightest sadness or upset, and she would commit hours to talking it through with you. Her time and warmth and attention would pool up around you until the problem had disintegrated within it. To those who liked her, Sarah was a girl of boundless enthusiasm and an open heart, a book that wanted to be read. To those who didn't, she was a dilettante, a passionate fool. She had brown hair that curled more the longer it got and was a beautiful soul. She seemed like the kind of girl who could be convinced to join a cult. She fell for it, of course. She started by asking Beth, whom we hadn't gotten to yet either. And while Beth agreed that Greg was weird, as she always had, it was in a sisterly way and thus wasn't systematized. Sarah bounced from person to person in this manner until she talked to Claire, who herself was an agent of the dark and had, truth be told, her own separate agenda that was as yet unconnected to ours. Yeah, Claire said, skimming her eyes over the long line of cars waiting to exit the parking lot. It was second lunch period when sophomores and juniors ate, and they were outside Adena High. The unlikely bond between the two of them had formed over a shared and wicked love of mid-2000s pop punk, which Sarah had developed before they were friendly, but after she learned of Claire's interest in such music. So she was genuinely passionate about it, but the passion had a larger aim. Anyway, Claire said, "Do you know anything about Half Blessed?" "I think I've heard the name," Sarah said, which was typically how she engaged with Claire's expansive cultural milieu. Claire, at present, had a shaggy Chelsea haircut that was dyed blue and wore a seasonal leather jacket whose pins changed daily, which lent her the kind of standoffish wisdom of someone who inhabits multiple eras. Had you asked Claire at this point, she wouldn't have called her and Sarah friends exactly, nor would she have admitted that her love for pop punk, a genre she had never experienced in its contemporary moment, was anything but ironic. "Is that like a band?" Sarah said. "I guess it was a band after the fact." Another common answer, there was always an obscure band buried somewhere, but it's more of a belief system, Claire said. "A belief system? Like some kind of religious thing?" Claire shrugged. "I mean, I guess as much as you'd consider iconography religious," she used air quotes. "You'd see plenty of inverted crosses and whatnot, but they're not exactly burning churches, not in this decade anyway." She paused and bit her lip, seeming to consider. "I guess it's more of a society," is how they would put it, with some magical overtones. Basically teenage Illuminati, but more social, like about ostracizing and status climbing, or like they'll squat your house and slaughter a pig in the living room, blind fires, stuff like that. Basically, it's just a clique, but with secret handshakes, sex pacts, and blood rituals to appeal to the high school crowd. Obviously, Claire had lost sight of her answer to Sarah's question long before the words had finished leaving her mouth, but the important thing was that she had created a context for Sarah's future inquiries. Half Blessed was a group thing, stringent like a religion, but not a religion, and disregarding the rest, had pegged it with a few terms Sarah could use to propel her investigation further, namely sex pacts and blood rituals and something called blind fires. Was Greg a part of it? Was that what made him act the way he did? After their lunch period ended at 12:52, Claire drifted off to trigonometry, which she called trigonometrics in the spirit of complication, pretty much having forgotten everything that she'd said, while Sarah crossed the school's hypotenuse from the south to the west unit and climbed the stairs to her AP English class, where she embarked on further literary analysis and, similarly, traced dense passages of text for their older meanings. Coincidentally, for different reasons, during that same period, Beth's older brother Greg spread a wide swath of his own blood across the stall door in one of the first floor men's bathrooms. If one was dedicated to the cause, they could have found some geometry in it, or geometric hits. At the bathroom, the very stall was directly one floor below the seat in English where Sarah sat, but no one was making those connections at this point. That's where I will leave it. Yeah.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Eugene.
Thanks to Literati too, and thanks for watching, and to Atticus and John and everyone who helped organize it. It's a pleasure talking with you, Simon. It's a great book. It's fantastic and dark. Mona Awad calls it a work of evil genius with an incredibly controlled and incredibly sinister tone. So I thought one place we could start is with that we narrator that you start the book with, that first person plural narrator that kind of threads through the book. This we character seems to have both supernatural powers and malicious intent. Tell me a little bit about this we narrator. How did it come to you? And here's a kind of a writerly way to approach it maybe. When you came up with it, how did you feel What did it feel like to come up with that narrator?
Yeah, I love that question. So the first thing, when I work on a new project, I feel like I'm very driven and inspired by tone. So usually when I start a project, there'll be like a fragment or a tone that a fragment or a sentence or a tone that I'm trying to capture that I then will like pull out and experiment with and try to explore in like longer format. So for this project, I think the first line that I wrote was actually one that, that survives relatively intact, is in the portion that I just read, which was Sarah seemed like the kind of girl who could be convinced to join a cult. And so that was the first line that I wrote of the book. And I think at the time I was like, oh, maybe I'll write I'll write like a cult story. And so, but that sentence was the first little piece that came to me. And that sort of set, that sort of set the tone for the rest of the project, where it's this very sort of self-aware, a little bit sinister, kind of has an agenda, a little bit sinister, but also self-aware, but like very closely kind of casual and intimate, but and very kind of closely observing the character. And so that tone was one that I followed to to get to that kind of we narrator. And I think initially I was probably thinking of the we that narrates the book and interjects in occasional moments and sometimes makes its presence more known or less known, or is otherwise, as you put it, just sort of threaded throughout the book. I think initially I was thinking of it as a sort of, it could have been a literal like group of people. I think when I was first writing the book and thinking, oh, I'm going to write a book about a cult, it was like the voice of a collective that had people in it. But I think over time, as the book's canvas sort of expanded and changed, the nature of the narrator got more and more diffuse. Until it became, I don't think I'm spoiling anything when I say that the collective we that narrates the book is not, it's not like a cabal of people or something like that, but I think it's kind of a force or, some kind of entity that can take many shapes and is more a frame than an actual kind of character in the a specific person or set of individuals. So I think over time, as I sat within that tone, the nature of the we kind of changed, and as I said, diffused and turned into something else, into almost like almost sort of a framing device, or like a ended up being more serving as an atmospheric texture, kind of a filter for viewing the story than a distinct character. So, when I think about how I felt, I feel like, the moments where we as a narrator comes into the book are very intentional and deliberate and kind of scattered throughout the narrator. But I think how it felt is, you have that kind of like skin crawly, like prickle of observation, if you feel like you're being watched. And I feel like that was the sensation that sensation I tried to capture whenever we are present in the book and, intangible. And, so, and obviously as a writer, that inspires glee in me to be able to render, sinister forces and stuff. So, but yeah, that's I love that question.
It's an incredible tone that you achieve, and that there's like a demonic surveying kind of a voice that it has. It's interesting to think about it that in kind of an initial idea, it was the people of the cult, speaking kind of a collective voice, and then it kind of but over the course of time in the composition, it kind of gets disembodied and more occult.
Right. Yeah. Cult to occult. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not I'm not a regular reader of horror, so I was gonna so one theory of horror, which might be a hacky theory that I've read, is that it operates. People like it because it can operate as a kind of exposure therapy, a desensitization almost, because it puts the object of one's fear in a kind of controlled and staged area. But when then I thought about your novel, and it did not seem like exposure therapy, it seemed more like a gateway drug, in the sense that it's not a controlled artifice at all that you're expressing, but it feels like an attempt to articulate the horror we are living through. And it's trying to reflect accurately. And the tone that you mentioned, I think a critical response might focus on the tone, because the tone of horror, the tone of your horror is in no way superficial. It's kind of the substance, it's the essence of it in a way. What's your relationship to the horror genre? And did you think of this as a horror novel, or did you think of this as inspired by? How do you feel about your use of the tropes and defiance of them?
Yeah, I think I guess the way that I would describe this book is as a coming of age novel via cosmic horror, kind of. It attempts to render what I think is a common teenager experience, but it's sort of through the filter of horror. My I have a long-standing relationship, I guess, with the horror genre. I grew up like very, very into, horror and spooky things, but extremely sensitive to like violence, which was really, interesting. Like my brothers and I used to like run a haunted house in our basement growing up. And so we were really, really into the spooks from an early age. But, I was also like, I've come to really enjoy like a lot of horror movies and books and stuff like that. But it was never really it was sort of like, I was more drawn to the themes behind horror rather than like being like a gore hound or anything like that. And I feel like the best kind of horror is something that uses horrific elements to do some kind of social commentary and to make insightful kind of sociocultural like observations. Like I'm thinking of movies like Get Out or Rosemary's Baby or something like that. So it's like I gravitate more towards that kind of stuff personally. But I feel like one of the tropes of horror is that it's such a embodied and like visceral genre. So I think in taking some elements of that genre in this book, what I wanted to render here was, again, that kind of teenage experience in all of it as kind of deeply felt and visceral as it can feel in those moments. I think that can often, like being a kid can feel like, can kind of feel like a horror movie in that way, like, where there are like, where things feel very kind of visceral and horrific, even if they're, sort of the day-to-day vicissitudes of life. So I think, I kind of took that framing of like a kind of a coming of age story, but it's sort of shot through with this like, by deciding that it's a horror story that I'm telling. And so everything becomes charged with that sort of violent, undercurrent and, looking at these, interpersonal interactions or like violent things like through a lens of, through the lens of like kind of shock and, and trying to create that visceral response in the reader to make you feel like you're really there and in the moment, and to, make a normal, an everyday conversation feel really tense and unsettling and sinister and charged through with all these unknown symbols and threats. So I feel, as a writer, my work, I feel is a little bit hard to, I think it's been hard for publishers to classify, because I feel like I really go for a kind of grab bag of genre elements that I feel will serve the book's purpose. And, I seem to not be able to help myself but to make it at least a little bit spooky. So
there's definitely the I want to talk about the kind of teenage coming of age aspect in a bit, but there's but you take different aspects of horror that we've seen that are familiar, from, I think I saw an Instagram post or something where you're talking about Charles Burns?
Oh yeah, yeah, Black Hole.
Black Hole, and you have like maybe there's a Lynchian idea to it, or there's like there are definite kind of the alienation of adolescence we definitely feel. But I think you have like different planes or different aspects of different kinds of horror adjacent, almost canonical horror adjacent kind of tropes that you put together, you kind of integrate into this into a spookiness that's all your own.
Thank you.
Before we leave the horror genre question, what kind of horror books do you like? Are there authors that you want to shout out, and do you think Stringfollow is in conversation with any of them?
Yeah, I like, I do think like Stringfollow, it like borrows some, well, you mentioned Black Hole, which I think was a really strong influence on this book. And for those unfamiliar, it's a graphic novel by Charles Burns, set in suburban Seattle in the 1970s, and it follows a group of teenagers. And in the book, there's a sexually transmitted disease, only transmissible among teenagers, and if you get it, it like mutates you physically, and sometimes in really subtle ways, but sometimes in really like severe and deforming ways. And I think it's a really beautiful book, because Charles Burns has this very kind of really stark monolithic style where the characters are really giant. There's like really intense shadows, and the whole narrative is kind of filled with these like visual symbols and stuff that recur kind of across the book. And it really puts you in the headspace of like being a teenager, and kind of trying to, feeling alienated, but also feeling like there's, an order out there that you just don't understand, which I feel like was something I very much tried to bring to Stringfollow. And so that was a big influence. I also think about books like It by Stephen King, where, it's where I think a big part of that book is kind of exploring a haunted space, and how a kind of intergenerational trauma, and like a violence that persists kind of across the decades, and kind of generationally affects like a group of people or a whole town. And I think so it does that in, way too many pages, but it does that very well. There's also like a zombie baseball team and giants for some reason. So I think about that. And then I think like a book like John Darnielle's Universal Harvester, I also think about a lot. And that's a book that's like very intimately about the Midwest. Like it's set in Iowa. It's a very intimate novel about the Midwest, but it also brings in these like sort of spooky found footage, like horror elements to it, that to also explore kind of questions of inherited trauma and stuff like that in a really interesting way. And I feel like John Darnielle as a writer, who's also he's the singer and songwriter for the band The Mountains. And I feel like he really borrows from a lot of different like genres as well, in a way that I think is always interesting. So yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know the Darnell, but the others. When I saw that you mentioned Charles Burns, I thought that was it made a lot of sense to me. But all the books that you mentioned, I'm not sure about the last one, have kind of adolescent protagonists, and I think there is something about either puberty or adolescence or young adulthood that is that seems intertwined with the horror genre in some sense.
Yeah.
But you also and the violence. So I have a couple questions about the violence in the book, because you had mentioned you liked horror, you liked the spooks, but you weren't so much into the violence, which. So I have a few questions about the use of violence in the book, both the why and the how of it. For the why of it, I thought we could approach it because there's actually a school shooting scene in the book. It's the origin story for Graham, who's a hardcore singer, and he's in a band and he's the singer and he has debilitating headaches, and the headaches are kind of mixed in with this origin story where there's a school shooting. I won't go into it, but to have a school shooting in a book it has so much gravitational power. Usually, it's like it's almost by necessity so traumatic and has such a kind of gravitational well on the other events around a book or a narrative. But here, it's not secondary, but it's submerged and woven into the kind of ambient violence that these teenagers are constantly walking through. It's inextricable with that atmosphere of inexhaustible mayhem or ominous threat. Could you talk about this threat, the sense of threat that is unending, and if it has a relationship, how does it, and why is it drenching these teenagers' lives so thoroughly?
Yeah. I think drenched is such a good word, and I'm really gratified to hear that you picked up on to hear that that's what you picked up on, because I feel like one of the things that I was trying to kind of show in the book is just like how just capture that sort of ambient dread and violence that I feel like exists in being a teenager in this kind of day and age. Like, I think like our the world that we live in is maybe no more violent on its I think we live in a world that is increasingly racked by violence. And now so it's a world that's increasingly racked by violence, but then it's also a world in which that violence is all the more persistent and in your face all the time because of how much you're reading about it or experiencing it in your day-to-day life. So in this context, because we spend our days reading the internet and and just being saturated with data about what's about like the bad things that are happening in the world. I think it kind of becomes like the air that you breathe. Like, it's almost like I feel like there's it's a grotesque, I feel like there's like a grotesquely familiar experience where you open your phone or you look at Twitter or something and you read about like there's like another mass shooting that's happened, and you have that sort of we've almost gotten to a point where you have a like expected reaction to that, where you have like those, you have like an idol horror that, you experience those kind of moments with, because they've become so routine and they're so like woven into like our culture now. And, maybe that stuff has always been happening, but now it's like omnipresent. You're reading about it all the time. The data of it is just overwhelming. And, so I think like what I wanted to show in this book was that, I think there is like a lot of violence in it, or things that, from these small like interpersonal microaggressions to, massive, defining violences like a mass shooting or something like that. And, and so what I wanted to kind of explore in this book was like how, how that those acts of, violence, whatever they are, whether they're these like small interpersonal moments or like much bigger things, are sort of part of the same current, and how they, how they can, feel so oppressive, and so and really like can drench you and make it hard to slog through the world, because you're just kind of overwhelmed with it, to the point where you don't know what to do with it.
We were
yeah
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's
We were talking before about how, before we started, I think we were talking with Atticus about how rough it is for young people during this pandemic, how isolating it can be, but also, I mean, I work at a high school, and I see, and I have an 8-year-old, and just to see the instability affect them,
right,
just in the pandemic, but also like before, all day today, I was scrolling through Twitter about Ukraine, and trying to leave Twitter and coming back to Twitter to scroll about, there is a kind of increased violence in our lives that may be born from the internet. So let me ask the same question in a different way though. You have a transition scene, which is from a kind of moving people around, kind of wizardly, in the sense it's super complicated. There are these people that are emerging from a traumatic event in a basement. There's a woman upstairs in the same house, and then then somehow they all get into a car together. And this is the paragraph that I want to read, when Sarah gets in the car with the basement dwellers. Now she was in the darkened car with these three dressed in identical white t-shirts, their only real visual signifier in the darkness of the car, like some kind of cult. With no idea where they were going, the girl next to her nodding quietly as she talked, the silent driver she thought she might recognize from school carrying them onward, the other girl smushed into the window like she was dead, and somehow Sarah felt more akin to these shadowy strangers, safer in this back seat in its recirculated, weirdly blood-smelling air than she had with anyone in the last month. They shared this pocket of the same desperation, fear, rage, a frantic careening into the future. So the question was something like, does the death drive among youth feel greater now? Is in some fucked up way, is this relentless violence just now part of American adolescence? And then maybe this is a good time to ask, why is this book about teenagers?
Yeah, I think I think it is. I don't know if I would call it. I don't know if I would personally classify it as a death drive, but I think it.
Okay.
I think it is. But I think it is a current. I think it is a current that is. But I think that is a temptation. I think it's there, and I think there is a. I think with that, in that paragraph, I feel like, what there is a little bit is there's like a almost a yearning for something greater and something that has meaning, even if you don't, even if you don't know what it is, like some, a form of certainty, like certainty is better, where certainty feels better than uncertainty, even if the certainty is really, bad and violent and, and oppressive. So I feel like maybe the death drive isn't greater, but like its call is more tempting and more like in your face than it used to be. Like, I feel like, to some extent nowadays, it's like, especially like with all the kind of isolation that was brought from like the, not just the pandemic, but just like, in general, by existing in spaces on the, existing in spaces on the internet, rather than finding those spaces like, with other people, in person. But you have these like, you end up with these like relatively like unfiltered ways into these violent ideologies, that exist, that exist like online or can kind of take root online. So I feel like while, maybe the death drive isn't greater, there's like so many more like paths into it, or like into that mindset, where you can like, you are watching self-help videos on YouTube, and it like, like gradually transitions into like, gradually and subtly transitions into like, crypto fascist, like, stuff. And, you can get kind of lost there. So I feel like it's like, yeah, maybe the death drive isn't greater, but it's like, but it's a much greater suction perhaps than it used to be, just because there's so many ways to fall into it and to get pulled in a way that you don't really know is happening. And so I guess like in this book, I feel like what these like kids are looking for is like to be a part of, is like an order. They feel all this chaos around them, and they're just looking for somewhere they're just looking for something to exist within. And like in that moment where, Sarah's like running out of the house, and she doesn't know what she's going to do, and she feels desperate and angry and terrified, and, sees a place to go, which is like these like, a car, like these strangers, and she just like decides like, that's what I'm going for. So I feel like, yeah, it's just, the vacuum is stronger than ever, I guess. I don't know. I feel like I used a lot of very mixed metaphors to answer.
That's okay. That's all right. I think
that's why it took me months to write a chapter, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, when you're writing a book, you're articulating very carefully. I think the temptation is, or at least your book makes the case that it is convincingly stronger, perhaps because of, and we turn to occult or cultish thinking when we've been robbed, when we're getting close to end times, getting close to desperation, getting close to confronting the meaninglessness of what we're going through. And I think that is a common state in adolescence often, where you're searching for meaning.
Oh, yeah.
That passage also used the word cult, and we started the book with Sarah as a girl who could join a cult. You said, I just thought I'd give you an opportunity to talk about this a little bit. What is the idea of a cult to you? What is its power, or what is it relative to, and what does it perhaps symbolize? What does it reflect, and what does it perhaps symbolize against the larger society? Or do you want to talk about cults in any way?
Yeah. I guess I would say, to me, a cult is, at least as it's kind of used in this book, it's like a an individual submerging themselves into kind of a collective conscious, I guess. Like, so it's like sort of, yeah, I guess like to return to my answer for what your last question, I feel like it's like finding, it's like putting yourself in an order. It's like finding an order or a system by which you can, that you could just throw yourself into, and maybe unquestioningly, and like, where you're granted a logic that maybe you feel is missing from the world or that you are desperate for. So I feel like part of like the reason the book is about teenagers is because that is a I love coming of age books and novels. Like that's like that's what I that's sort of my favorite kind of narrative. And I feel like so I like stories that are talking about how you find your place in the world. And I think what I was trying to say in this book is like, how do you reckon with a world as unrelentingly, violent as this? And, how do you find a place with it? How do you gird yourself to face that world while maintaining some form of agency and autonomy? So the cults that, surface and, whether real and present in the book, or just like the idea of kind of a cult or a collective consciousness, I feel like are the various represent various ways to like various ways or temptations to like cope with that. I think there's a line in the book. I think it's about the character of Typhus, but where one of the characters kind of thinks to himself that she wanted to like kind of put herself into something, and had just like chosen him because he was like there at the right moment and presented an opportunity for her to do that. And I feel like, that like the cultiness, like it speaks to the collective narrator, and it speaks to the various sort of communal spaces that exist like throughout the book in various forms, which I think someone could define as a, you could talk about the hardcore community as being like a cult. You could talk about the like, people who gather at like the church in the book as being a cult. You could talk about the like collectively voiced narrator of the book as being like a cult. So I feel like it's like, yeah, I guess, yeah, this like just a collective, entity where you can put an individual consciousness. And so, I think the kids in the book are trying to reckon with this chaotic and alienating world, and trying to find like a logic to it, and try to find like symbols that they can use to find some reason in it. And so that's kind of how it emerges to me, at least.
The temptation to join a collective, to join something bigger, certainly is it's reflective in that collective, in that narration, but it does, I think that that kind of summarizes a lot that's going through the book, like the alienation, the desperation, and due to kind of this relentless violence, and then the search for something bigger, and moving into a collective, trying to find a collectivity, but possibly a destructive one, or an ominous or sinister one. Here's a question from Martha Moody, but also it leads to a question I was going to ask about the age group also. At the end of the first section, at the very beginning, you write, there's a young man and his quote, his idle dark thoughts unspooling into the night, but his parents are not part of the story. And to offer a terrible comparison, it's an adultless world. The world of Stringfollow is a world without adults, like Charlie Brown is a world without adults. When in the process did you know it was going to be Sans without adults? Why did it have to be without adults?
Yeah, I don't think it's a terrible comparison at all. I think it's an extreme comparison, because in Charlie Brown, you have the only adults, you see them from the legs up, and they they speak in gibberish, and it's just, yeah, I actually kind of love that comparison. I think, I think the adults are not part of this, they're not part of the book because they're not part of the story. Like, I think that these are, the parental influence is barely there. I think, like, I like to think that the parents are there somewhere, but they just like are not really a factor in these kids' kind of day-to-day lives. Like, where they show up, it's like, I don't know, like, it's like someone is in a car, waiting, like someone brought a character somewhere, but like they're just like sitting in the car waiting. So I guess I took them. I took them out, but there are adults in the book because I feel like in the realities of these characters, they feel like there's no one looking out for them, and they feel like they're alone, and they're forced to kind of be the adults. They don't have a, they don't have someone who's like, I guess even if there's someone there, they just like don't feel their influence, and it doesn't really affect, like, it doesn't have a meaningful effect on how they're engaging with the world. It doesn't help them, I guess. So they're not in the, they're not there in the book because they don't feel like they're there to the kids.
No.
And yeah, I think like I got there was, I think, so one fun thing that I do for myself when I write books is I feel like one of the fun things about being a writer is like you can just invent rules for yourself. So one of the and then break them if you want to. So I had like to answer this question, there were a couple of rules that I set myself for this book. One of the rules was, for example, I started the book and I was like, okay, like I'm gonna write this story or book or whatever it is, and none of the characters are going to touch each other. There's going to be no human contact in this book. Like, it's going to be this really, it's going to be a very visceral book, but there is going to be no contact, and it's charged. And
so it's going to be, sorry, what charged? What'd you say? It's going to be
the book is going to feel very charged because like characters will never have a physical like interaction. And obviously, like I broke that rule like numerous times. Like, there's plenty of human contact, most of it unpleasant, like in the book. But I think by setting that rule for myself, and then by deciding only to break it in certain circumstances, it makes those moments of human connection, when it does happen, or physical connection, feel all the more kind of charged and visceral because I was kind of making a conscious decision to really limit them. So it's like, when someone like gets a hug or like touches someone else, it feels like really intense because those moments are like kind of rare in the book. And similarly, a rule that I set for myself was there are no adults. And I was like, and again, I broke that rule. Like, there are adults in the, background.
Props. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Props. That's exactly it. There are adults that are there that are props, but, I think that makes it all the more, like, there's a scene, I don't know, I don't want to spoil anything. There's a scene at the end of the book where there's an adult, and it's just, and I just feel like it works so much better because I set this rule, it makes it all the more, it adds to the uncanny environment. I think it makes sense for where the characters are mentally. It makes it feel like a more kind of alienated world where all you have are your peers. And what if your peers suck? Like, and you have all this like, yeah, you have all these forces beyond you, but there's not like a human face to them. really. Like it's just like these props and this like architecture of a world that is empty of adult signifier, that is full of adult signifiers but empty of adults. So
There are
that was fun.
The few times, I think I'm thinking of the scene you might be mentioning where the adult appears, and it has much more resonance because of
right.
because of okay. We have a couple audience questions, but also here's another question about violence, which might relate to this idea about touching, which is I thought was interesting. You have choreographed or arranged the violence in a really masterful way. We've spoken about how you establish this ominous tone using varieties of oppressive threat and foreshadowing. So there's always this threat of violence, but there's actually the violence happens, the event itself is not on screen, so to speak, for very long. It's either off screen or it's cut really fast from it. We see it at a glance, and then we quickly move on. Could you talk a little bit about how you choreograph or how you structure or how you think about the use of violence in the text? Maybe, I thought of it again when you were speaking about how you had a rule where there would be no touching, no, kind of taking out a sense of intimacy or contact in that sense.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like I wanted to, I wanted it to be very closely observed and intimate, but to really feel to really feel physically like what the characters are feeling in the moment. So, one route to that was by minimizing, physical contact. But I think I guess for me, there was a little bit of a balance in because it is just such a relentless book in a lot of ways. I tried to be strategic about the moments of violence that I lingered on, and wanted to make them feel as deeply felt as they would be by the character. So, I think I don't know. I'm describing this very, very vaguely, but I think one example, as an example of that, I think I was trying to find, because the book, as we talked about earlier, the book has these more, very intimate scenes that are sort of rendered as violent when there's just even if there's no physical violence, but there's a deception or sexual aggression, things like that, which I mean, that is physical violence, but I tried to render everything very physically, but on a scale that felt right to the character. So that means someone, when you feel you're if you're being lied to or tricked or deceived, wanting that to feel as visceral as someone swiping at you with a knife, for example. So I tried to be very selective about how I was balancing the ambient violence of the book with the embodied kind of violence that I was trying to show between the characters. So
definitely,
that's not a very good answer to your question, but
no, it's a great answer. It was. I think you did it incredibly well. I'm not going to try to. I'm going to try not to spoil any events, but well, here's a question. Maybe you can speak about place or a bit, but Graham asks, you mentioned how in It explores a haunted space. Can you talk about the nature of place or architecture in your work? The house in this book and the basement certainly is a character. The house functions as a metaphor for identity and possession. There's a basement that gets occupied. The owner of the basement, the purported owner is not loses control of that space. Palaces has a focus on places, abandoned spaces, a kind of a landscape of empty houses or empty mansions, if I remember correctly. So can you speak a little bit about place, architecture, space, how you move through it?
Yeah, I really like exploring lived spaces as a mindset. And I feel like that I tried to do that in STRINGFOLLOW with, like, you know, you have these like all these like kind of these similar kind of suburban homes where these characters live that have, you know, are basically like a series of interchangeable parts. And, you know, they're the terrain, the emotional terrain that these characters inhabit are ones where, you know, they're trying on a lot of different identities and seeing what fits. And, you know, nothing really, everything feels unfixed and unstable. And so, you know, in terms of place, I tried to, you know, I tried to capture that feeling as well, where, you know, where, you know, the idea of like home is, you know, kind of an ever changing thing, and the sort of spaces around you are liminal and transitional in the same way that your brain is at that time. So I really, you know, I enjoyed playing with that, and I enjoyed like the suburbs where STRINGFOLLOW takes place, you know, basically correspond with the suburbs where in Dayton, Ohio, where I grew up. So it was really fun for me to, like, as I was like you know, as I was like reckoning with my cast of characters, kind of like looking at a map and saying like, okay, like, where does everyone live? What does their route to school look like? What does their house look like? And, you know, what kind of car are they driving? Whose car is that? And like, how do these, you know, these elements of like where they live, what school they're going to, you know, their neighborhood, their, you know, their house or their apartment, and who they're living with, and how, you know, it was kind of interesting, you know, because I was, you know, exploring like characters from, you know, kind of a range of different like kind of class and socioeconomic kind of backgrounds, and sort of orienting all those folks like, you know, on this like map of, you know, around like a map of these like suburbs. So I feel like the, you know, the sort of spaces were also a way of like, you know, looking, helping do some of that, like the fun like class stuff that I really, you know, that I feel like I had a lot of fun with in writing.
And I think some of the choices of place had you know, like that the fact that the battle royale, so to speak, is in the garage, like this,
right.
Like a major place is the basement. These are not the main dwelling places. These are like the teenage hangout places, or
totally.
They annex to the main event where the disaffected go.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I'm realizing now as you're talking though is that there's a real criminal lack of porch content in STRINGFOLLOW. There's only one porch, and it's just full of rotted pumpkins. But no one really. I guess that, yeah, they're hanging out. I guess the porch is a little bit like, the porch is a good hangout spot, but only, you know, only when you're alone in the house. So I feel like it makes sense maybe that we're in the garages and the basements, because, you know, on the porches maybe a little more easily observed than basement, garage. This is a reckoning that I'm having just as your questions.
I might have another question, but Atticus, are we okay on time, or should I? Well, here's
you go for it.
Question.
Why don't you go for it? Ask her. We got some time.
Okay, cool. So here's Matt asks. This might be the last question. With respect to other writers, were there any horror tropes or other elements within horror novels that you wanted to avoid when writing this book?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I think I love a nameless horror. I love a horror that is, you know, that you can't see or reckon with. You know, I love a Lovecraftian horror that you cannot look upon. and that, exists beyond your comprehension. So I think I like to use horror as a framing. I feel like horror, it works best as a framing device, but not like, but I didn't want to throw, monsters or serial killers or anything. I wanted to keep I tried to keep the content of this book very close to reality. Like, I do not think that there's anything that happens in this book that is, not real to life. I think if anything, it's like very gently apart from real life. But I feel I tried to cleave intentionally, like very close to reality, but to just like sort of render it in a horrific way. And so, I feel like what I was borrowing from horror was more styles and, tones and atmosphere than necessarily like, a serial killer or like like a monster or something like that. Like there is like, I think a great, there are monstrous forces in this book, but I think but they are left sort of tantalizingly undefined and subject to interpretation. So yeah, I feel like it was like a lot about borrowing modes of horror rather than like specific tropes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you take the mode of horror, but with the kind of the violence, like how we had the discussion about the violence. It's the threat of it. It's basically like how you said earlier that you weren't into the gore, like you're not into the like that's a slasher kind of trope is. That's the cartoony aspect of horror can be, and you had all the subtext that comes around the actual slash.
Yeah, it's funny that this book ends up like when I've gone to visit this book in bookstores, as one does when one has a book out. It's always in the horror section, and it's got a very horror-y. It's got it's kind of marketed as a horror book, which I just think is really interesting because I would probably not, when I was writing it, I wasn't really thinking of it that way. I was like borrowing those techniques and stuff like that because I wanted to make it, feel really intense and visceral, but I wasn't really thinking of it as a horror book. So it's interesting that, I don't know, I guess that's just one of the challenges of being a writer is, you don't know how your book is ultimately like gonna be read, but I guess it feels successful to me that people read, the editor, reads this and is like, this is a horror book.
I think it is successful. It's wildly successful in achieving its sinister evil genius, as Mona Awad says, but it's also I had kind of a similar experience, sometimes gets lumped in a science fiction genre, but what I think is happening is genres, readers and writers are becoming also, there's more mature in the genre experience. There's kind of a blending and an understanding and a kind of more self-aware use of these tones and tropes and genres.
Absolutely.
There's Atticus. Well, Simon, I wanted to just say thank you so much. This has been a terrific conversation.
And thank you, Eugene. This is great. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I have too. I've just been sitting in the background, but thank you also to everybody else who has been here. And thank you to Simon and Eugene. This has been a blast. And thank you all for joining us on At Home with Literati. And make sure to go buy Stringfellow. We have it on our website and in store. I've already posted the link in the chat. So
yeah, and also buy Dear Cyborgs and Search History, which are Eugene's two most recent and impeccable books.
Yeah.
So
let's make them all happen. Let's go read. All righty. Well, thank you all so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Eugene, and thank you, Literati, for hosting.
Yeah. All righty. Well, have a good night, y'all.
Take care, everyone.